understand that symbolism only functions through analogy, and it also functions through structure. So you always, if someone's talking about symbolism and isn't ultimately talking about pattern and structure, but is trying to just say that this thing means that, then you can already stop paying attention to what they're saying, because it's going to be extremely trite.
What's up, guys? Josh here, and today we're going to be talking about how to understand Jonathan Pageau, and also his brother, Matthew Pageau, and Jordan Peterson, for that matter. So if you don't understand Jonathan Pageau, but you want to, I completely understand where you're coming from. It's been years ago now, way back when Jonathan was first starting his videos, I was watching him, and so many of the things that he would say just went completely over my head. And it was frustrating, to say the least, because I knew I could understand him if I had the right tools, if I read the right books. And I knew he was onto something. Right, there was truth in what he was saying, and there were fragments, little glimpses of truth that I was able to grab a hold of, and those were enough to keep me going, keep me pushing into this very alien way of viewing reality, which is the medieval and ancient way of viewing reality. It's actually our modern materialistic sort of mindset is just a radical shift from what humans have always believed about this world, this metaphysical world around us.
Is to always look and see if the person is connecting things to a broader pattern and is also able to see analogies with other things. So if you're not able to see analogies with other things, then that's when the interpretation is in danger. If you've noticed, like every video I make, I hope every video I make, I'm always trying to give you, let's say, the pattern, of a version of that pattern, the one that appears in scripture. And then usually I try to find a really, really surprising example, like something you hadn't thought of would be connected to that, so that you're able to say, okay, this really is a pattern, because this stupid movie or this strange phenomena in culture is connected to the same pattern. So they don't see the structural meaning. They see the relationship between the coming together of the elements and the meaning as an arbitrary relationship, as a kind of weird jump that has nothing to do with the actual structure of reality. And so the best thing to do is to just try to see what they're talking about and try to understand whether or not they believe that there are structural reasons, like that something is an instantiation of itself, right? That's what symbolism is, right? And so the branch of a tree is the instantiation of the same pattern as the tree itself. So that's symbolism. It's when the pattern, the thing that symbolizes the pattern is an instantiation of the pattern. It's not just a random literary connection, right? Or it's not a disconnected set of things.
So what I'm going to do, I'm going to give you a few puzzle pieces, but really more than anything, I'm just going to focus on one thing, and that is analogy. Analogical reasoning, you could call it. You could call it symbolic reasoning, a symbolic understanding of reality. You can call it many different things, but really it's understanding analogy more than anything. That's what's important. Now, Jonathan Pageau, much like Peterson and their predecessors, you could say, Carl Jung on Peterson's side of things, and the Church Fathers on Pageau's, focus on universal patterns, archetypal patterns, you could say, that are found in literature in the form of myths, legends, and holy scriptures. And they're also found in human experience, psychologically, physically, and spiritually. Now, what Pageau is doing that I think is very important to understand is that he's giving you something like a map of reality. The patterns that he offers, that he takes from the Church Fathers and Rene Guénon and many others, they're the very fabric of reality, right? Especially when you're talking about, say, the logos or the Tao, as they're very similar in the East. In fact, they're one and the same if you're talking about the Christian concept of the Tao and the Logos. They're identical. And Eros, for that matter, right? Speaking of dualism, the duality of nature found in everything, right? We have heaven and earth, masculine and feminine, order and chaos. You hear Jordan Peterson, of course, talking a lot about order and chaos, life and death, unity and multiplicity, reason and intuition. It goes on. And each of these things, by the way, are very important. You can just take a deep dive into any one of those things, search it on Google, look up videos on it, see if you can find Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pageau videos on those specific forms of duality. But before we dig into this, let's talk about why it matters. So one, every form of success, whether you're talking relational, intellectual, entrepreneurial, financial, spiritual, all of the above requires an intimate understanding of the patterns of reality. Even if, actually, especially if the understanding is like the street smarts understanding, right? Gained through intuition and especially experience. Right, embodying, participating in these patterns, as Pageau would put it, properly is infinitely more important than gaining mere knowledge of them. Knowledge puffs up, love builds up, as the scriptures say. This is why going to church, a church with a liturgy that hasn't really changed over the ages from its ancient mode and function, is so important to Jonathan Pageau and myself as well. And I think we're even seeing that with Jordan Peterson lately, which is fascinating. It's one thing to understand the scriptures, say a scripture that says to feed the hungry or care for the orphans, something like this. And it's another thing entirely to take those words and act them out, right? In real life, do those things. There's a massive difference, and it's an incredibly important thing to understand, of course. It makes it very difficult to deny. This is number two. Number two, it makes it very difficult to deny the metaphysical world around us, the invisible world of archetypes, you could say, using Jungian language, and identities and agencies, as Pageau would put it, etc. And that includes God's existence, right? Because analogy reveals the invisible, and analogical reasoning is, it is logically, scientifically proven that analogical reasoning is a sound way to understand the world around us. And we'll dig a little bit into that. And there are many other benefits, but I'll leave it at that for now because I want to jump right into this. So Jonathan Pageau, he'll say provocative but true things like Santa Claus is real, or the tooth fairy is real, or dragons are real, right? Much like Jordan Peterson in his debate with Richard Dawkins over dragons, right? They both explain that they're as real as anything, and even more real, you could say, than material things, because as archetypes, the way Peterson would call them, or Jonathan again would call them something like identities or agencies or patterns, they exert massive influence in the world, influencing human behavior more than just about any single person ever could, for example. And I think, like I said before, the best way to understand the Pageau brothers and Jordan Peterson as well, of course, is to understand analogy and its role in understanding reality. So I'm going to give you something like 12 to 20 patterns. The list kept growing, but I think that these are going to help you crack the code to understanding Pageau and Peterson. If you take these patterns of reality, which are fundamental truths, and take some time to understand them, And this is key, right? Like really dig into them. Understand that these are coming from not just Jonathan Pageau and Peterson, but Carl Jung from on Jordan Peterson. For Jordan Peterson, right? A lot of his symbolism and his symbolic understanding of the world is coming from Carl Jung. From Jonathan Pageau, we're talking Rene Guénon, the Church Fathers, Saint Maximus the Confessor, Saint Gregory of Nyssa, so on and so forth. Origen, I think a bit. Basil, I'm sure. He's got a great reading list, by the way, that I highly recommend. Remind me if I forget to put the link down below if you want it. But anyways, yeah, really dig into each of these, listen to them, re-listen to the examples that I give so that you understand them, and then try to explain the concepts yourself. Right. For me, that's the best thing that you could possibly do to really nail down your understanding of difficult concepts and ideas. You can also Google them, talk to ChatGPT about them. Although ChatGPT is a dirty liar, lies so much, but it can be a good starting point for sure, especially if you know what prompts to use. And you demand sources and you look into those sources and make sure that they're good and watch videos about them, etc. Eventually and inevitably, you'll start to understand everything that he says. Also keep in mind, the reason he is hard to get is because he's operating in a pre-modern framework, right? He's describing a reality the way everybody did before the late Middle Ages, basically. Today, we have a modern, unfortunately materialistic and very reductive operating system, basically, that is incompatible with the medieval and ancient operating system. It's like trying to play a PC-only game on a Mac, or trying to drop a supercharged V8 engine into a minivan without any modifications. It's not going to fit, right? Until you make a bunch of very severe changes. Understanding, downloading each of these patterns and the patterns that Pageau gives us, these are the heavy modifications that you need to transform your mind, right? To install the supercharged V8 engine of ancient, non-materialistic understanding of reality that today we call metaphysical realism, or just realism. All right, so I'll give you these one by one, and I'll explain them a bit more after. Each of these statements is a truth revealed through analogical reasoning, that is, symbolic thinking, all right, seeing through comparisons. So the part resembles and thus reveals the whole. A very important one. I'll explain more. Some subcategories of that, just as examples, we have the shadow resembles and thus reveals the object. The reflection resembles and thus reveals the source. The roots of the tree resemble and thus reveal the branches, and vice versa. Nature is fractal. You've probably heard Jonathan Pageau say that maybe a few times if you listen to him at all, if you listen to him much. The effect resembles and thus reveals the cause. This is a really, really important one, and we'll dig into that a little bit more in a second. I'm going to skip past these subcategories because we're going to come back to them. The pattern resembles and thus reveals the principle. This is a good one. Probably not going to understand it from that, but I'll dig into that more and explain it. The microcosm resembles and thus reveals the macrocosm. Right, this is something like Plato's concept of the soul resembling the cosmos as a whole, the universe in its entirety. Right, they match in some sense, and the ancient Christian concept of not just the soul but also the body being composed in a like manner. Right, it's self-similar as to the cosmos. The sign resembles and thus reveals the signified. The symbol resembles and thus reveals the symbolized. The map resembles and thus reveals the territory. As Plato says in his cave analogy, the physical world is a shadowy representation of the invisible world of forms, or realm of forms, what Christians call the heavenly or the spiritual or supernatural, right? A lot of people check out when they hear those words, but it is what it is. You could call it the metaphysical world. You can call it the intelligible world, right? And just a quick tip, if you can, read Maximus the Confessor, St. Gregory of Nyssa, Thomas Aquinas, John Scott, what is his name? John Scotus Eriugena, Origen, Basil, right? This will put you light years ahead, right? I'm still slogging through them, and they're fantastic. But also Rene Guénon, he's phenomenal, but just be sure to separate the good from the bad with him, I would say. That would be the one thing I would say. Same thing with Origen, really. He says some wild stuff here and there. Okay. Analogical reasoning, right? Understanding things by observing their similarity, understanding through comparison. This is how we understand reality. Plain and simple, right? We use, if you actually think about how often we use metaphor, like it's insane. Like you can't, it's like impossible to have any kind of a conversation without metaphor, symbolic reasoning, analogical reasoning, analogies, symbols. Like it's pretty much impossible, right? Just try it sometime and really analyze it, and you'll see what I'm saying. Okay, let's go back through this list and explain a little bit. So the part resembles and thus reveals the whole. The reason why this is so important, we see this in everything. We see this, nature is fractal, and we can see that in the tree. If you pluck off a leaf, the pattern on that leaf, the veins in the leaf, that pattern is the exact same pattern as the branches. Like you pluck off a branch and it's like a little tree, and the rest of the tree has that pattern, but not just the rest of the tree. Below, right, in the root system, that follows the same pattern as well. And galaxies are like this, right? They're self-similar. The part closely resembles the whole. And why this is so important, if you want to understand the metaphysical world around us, the invisible world, the intelligible world, you have to be able to understand analogy, right? Because it's our only way of intuiting and understanding and describing this invisible world. If you want to understand God, to whatever degree that's even possible, you have to use analogy, right? We say things like, in Christianity, God is the Father, or Christ is the bridegroom, the church is the bride. Obviously, this is symbolic thinking, reasoning. These are analogies, and that's really the only way that you can talk about God, right? Now, anything that you ever come up with will be an analogy. So, yeah, we have a few examples of this, like the shadow. The shadow resembles and thus reveals the object, right? So my shadow that's cast on the ground, let's say you couldn't see me and you're just trying to understand what through that shadow, you would look at the outline of the shadow and the shape, and you would observe it from different angles perhaps, and ultimately you'd be able to say, oh, that's a person that's causing that shadow. The shadow reveals that much about the object. The part resembles and thus reveals the whole. The reflection is a similar concept. It resembles and thus reveals the source. Bronchial branches replicate at progressively smaller scales, resembling the overall lung structure. Lightning bolts are another good example of this in nature. If you look at the pattern of a lightning bolt, it is fractal, right? It's self-similar. Each part, like if you took one part, you could look at that part and say, okay, that reveals something about the whole, right, in terms of its pattern. And by the way, in philosophy, in metaphysics, Plato, for example, like I said before, he saw the soul as self-similar to the cosmos. And this is the he taught that the microcosm, right, the microcosm of, you could say, the human body or the human soul, it resembles the macrocosm, that is the cosmos as a whole, the universe as a whole. The effect resembles and thus reveals the cause. The fruit resembles and thus reveals the tree. Right, you'll know them by their fruit, Christ says, right, when he's talking about false prophets and false teaching, I believe. A child's face reveals the parents, right? The child resembles the parents and reveals something about the parents, both in terms of physical appearance and also personality and different skills and abilities that were probably passed on from the parents. In the same way that a painting reveals the heart and mind of the painter, musical composition reveals, I would say it reveals the very soul of the composer. In the same way, what Christians believe is that everything in reality points to the cause, to the creator. First off, everything that begins to exist must have a cause, and the universe began to exist, so it must have a cause, right? This is one of the proofs of God, and it's one of the most difficult things. You can't explain it in any way, really, properly, if you don't believe in God, right? Basically, you have to say that something came out of nothing, which is literally impossible. So the creation reveals something about the creator, right? And a lot of great scholars and thinkers in Christian history say that everything in our reality points in some way to the higher, to the heavenly, and to God, right? Everything reveals something about God. Humans especially, right? We're at the top of the hierarchy of being, not the very top, but here on Earth, you could say, at the very top of the hierarchy, are the ones that most closely resemble God, as humans are made in the image of God. So in the same way that a musician's, a songwriter's soul, heart, or essence bleeds into the song that he or she writes, and you can intuit that, and you can see that, and you can understand that, right? The words that they use, the emotion with which they sing, the beauty that they're able to encapsulate. In the same way, you can see and understand and experience God through nature, right? God's canvas, through the universe, God's canvas that his essence bleeds into in some sense. Think about a ripple in the water. The ripple being the effect, it reveals something about the cause, right? So as an angler, right, this is something that I can tell you probably most of the time when I see a splash on the water or see the splash on the water, I can generally tell you pretty accurately what type of fish caused that splash. Not all the time, because it really does depend on the season. Sometimes are tricky, but just for example, at a certain time of the year, and you're at the lake and you're seeing big fish splashing, and what a lot of new fishermen would think is, oh, it's a great day to fish. I got to get out there. I got to throw my line right where I see the splash. I'm probably going to catch a big fish. But what they don't know is that, in what is it, like late spring, early summer, I think, all those big splashes in this particular body of water are breeding carp, basically, right? They're spawning carp. They're not interested in what you're throwing at them. And so one really important thing to understand about that is the only way I could possibly accurately know what type of fish or what type of animal caused the splash is by knowing a number of other details as well. Right, like the knowing what type of fish are in this body of water, what type of fish make that type of splash or swirl or V-line in the water, and why and how. Knowing what type of fish are spawning right now, or what type of fish are in pre-spawn and are super aggressive, if they're feeding on top water, if there is a hatch of mayflies, say, for example, and there's so on and so forth. There's a million and one different important details. But the reason I bring this up is because each of those details is like a fragment of a map. The map of reality that is my understanding of the reality of I don't know what you want to call it, the angling reality of fish, something like that. And this is exactly how Jonathan Pageau's patterns work, right? Each of the symbols that he explains, the patterns that he goes through, they're like a little fragment of a map of reality, and sometimes it takes a lot of those fragments. You have to put together all these different puzzle pieces until you have enough of the puzzle put together so that you can say, "Oh, now I get it. I understand it. I don't understand it completely. I'm still missing the upper left part of the map or something like that, but I can see it now." And so it really takes a lot of patience, I think, to gather enough of these fragments to really see what's going on. And just a reminder there, that is analogical reasoning, right? To say that this splash is caused by, a trout or a largemouth bass or a panfish. You know that through analogy, right? You know that because the effect resembles and thus reveals the cause, right? The effect being the splash or the ripple, and the cause being the fish. The pattern resembles and thus reveals the principle. The patterns of Joseph's life. This is interesting. You see in Joseph's life, it follows a pattern of descent before ascent, right? He's thrown down into the pit. He's by his brothers and then sold into slavery, right? And this descent down into the jail, into slavery, bondage. And that precedes his ascent to ruling all of Egypt. And he's a type of Christ. Christ, of course, has the ultimate version of that story of descending before ascending, right? He descends into death and even hell, and the harrowing of hell, which led to the ascension into glory and heaven. This is what Jonathan Pageau speaks of all the time, right? The transforming of death into glory. These patterns reveal a metaphysical reality, of course, right? Metaphysically, to ascend, you must first descend, means that elevation or transcendence, whether spiritual, intellectual, or existential, it requires a descent into pain, suffering, humbling, stripping away, or death of some form before the transformation can occur, right? This is just a reality of the world that we live in. And there are reasons for that as well, but we won't dig into that in this particular video. And this applies at every level of reality. And of course, the biggest version, the highest version of this is Christ's descent and then ascent. This is what the old alchemist saying in sterculinus invenitur means, right? In filth it will be found. In Jungian terms, just like the deep cave of the dragon contains the treasure, the shadow of an individual contains gold. Right? You have to descend before you can ascend. The microcosm resembles and thus reveals the macrocosm. We've talked about that enough, I think, at least for now. The sign resembles and thus reveals the signified. We see a lot of this in the scriptures. Yeah, Jesus said, so they came to Jesus and they said that they wanted a sign. And this is obviously paraphrased, but Jesus says something like, a wicked and adulterous generation asks for a sign. I'm not going to give you a sign except for the sign of Jonah, right? And so he's saying that basically he's pointing to the fact that his life is a sign, right? It was the sign of the Star of Bethlehem, for one, pointed to this ultimate sign of the times, you could say. And of course, from Jonah, what happens is you have one of the ultimate patterns of descending into the abyss, into chaos, into death, into the ocean, and being swallowed by the great fish or the sea monster, the tannin, I think it was. That precedes the ascent, when he gets spat out and he does the will of God. And then we have that Jonah, in that sense, is a type of Christ, pointing to, or a prefiguration of Christ, that's pointing to Christ's life and death, where he is swallowed up by death and descends into the earth, into the cave, and ultimately all the way down into the very bowels of hell, and then ascends into heaven, right, to be seated at the right hand of the Father. So these signs are all over the place. They're fantastic. There's the sign of Solomon's life, and there's so many of them. We could go into a bunch of them, but I'm going to try to keep this a little bit shorter. Yeah, ultimately, analogical reasoning, understanding our reality through analogy. This is something that we do all of the time. We do this in science. We do this in logic. We do this in philosophy, just across the board, and just in our day-to-day lives. That's how we understand the world around us. And it's incredibly, incredibly important. If you want to understand anything about the metaphysical world, if you want to understand anything about the spiritual reality that we live in, if you want to understand anything about God, or what people call the supernatural or the heavenly or the intelligible, you have to have this. You have to understand analogy. And so that's, I think, the most important tip I could give you in understanding Jonathan Pageau is understand analogy. As if it's some like little thing. It's difficult. It takes time. But again, his reading list is very helpful. Rene Guénon, he's, I wouldn't say he's simple. I wouldn't say he's easy to read, but very helpful if you do understand him. If you don't understand him right away, I would point you to one thing that you could do that's really helpful in the beginning is, if you struggle with reading the church fathers or, philosophers like Plato or Aristotle, it can be helpful to read what other people say about them, and about their specific teachings. That can be really helpful, right? I found a lot of people that break down, say, like St. Maximus the Confessor's metaphysics really well. If you're interested in that, let me know. I'll put it in the comments below, or put it in the description below. But yeah, that's basically all I have for you. Hopefully that's helpful. I know it can be very frustrating trying to understand, this symbolic world, this ancient mode of thinking and understanding reality. It is so alien to our modern, more materialistic understanding of the world, right? Where we place science and empiricism and naturalism, materialism at the very top of the hierarchy, which is a massive mistake. It's incredibly reductive. It reduces our reality to a tiny fragment of what it actually is. And the more you dig into that, the more you realize it's true. And the more you realize it's true, it really, what's the word they've been using? And it re-enchants the world. And it's an amazing and an exciting thing. So anyways, thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, share it with your friends and family, and I will see you in the next one.